We flew the work from yesterday to today. We had headings, we tried to group things according to themes, but we've heard about the verb yesterday all the time. So we just continue with the verb. We have two presenters. If you missed it, there are also two handouts that will be explained why you have two. And in order not to waste time, I give the floor to first to Tom and then to you.
Yeah, thanks. Just for explaining the handouts, there are two. It's a double talk by Jeff and myself, but we didn't get around to integrating it soon enough. So the first part is by the two of us, the introduction. Then I'll continue with part two on the pre-stem cluster, and the other handout on the stem follows. So first you start with the handout which has introduction on the left side. Okay, so we are going to present our ideas about the early verbal form in Proto-Bantu or early Bantu, whatever that is. And in figure 1 you see the well-known reconstruction by Mason. It's a little bit adapted, but nevertheless you will recognize Mason's reconstructions of a highly complex, morphologically fused predicate with a root with multiple prefixes and suffixes. And at the same time, all of you are aware of the fact that actually within Bantu there's much more diversity compared to that reconstructed pattern. So in one you have a representative example of that supposed proto structure, actually with excessively many prefixes and suffixes, and you know that even in Savannah Bantu such word forms will be very rare as well, but they are possible. And then, as opposed to that, Northwestern language in Tuewando, where all this predicate is actually dissected into separate phonological words. The same applies to Agam in grassroots Bantu language. Derek's book is an extensive discussion of all the issues surrounding the word or the word structures in Bantu. We think here it involves primarily the lexical verb, pronominal plus reference for subject and object, sometimes multiple, and of course what we call predicate operators like auxiliaries, particles, affixes of variable positions and hosts. And of course, tone eventually will have to be taken into account, but we won't say much about it, right? Okay. Now there is no consensus on the historical interpretation of that diversity in modern Bantu. So there are basically three hypotheses. One extreme is Bantu or pre-Bantu Benue was extremely isolating and diffused. This is Meinhof, and it's actually obsolete. Nobody discusses that anymore. So everybody agrees there was some amount of morphological complexity in this early language stage. Then there's a second hypothesis as per Mason, a highly compact proto-language. And possibly, what I don't think the most recent proposal is that actually the proto-language was somehow intermediate between the extreme position of A and B, and this was characterized actually with various patterns. So it's not even possible to say, well, this is the proto-structure, but actually there were many different proto-structures, and these would have been differentiated also with respect to fusion and what was attached to what, etc., etc. Right now, there are two current hypotheses. As I've said, A is kind of out, so B we call the compact predicate, and you would expect that the modern picture in a language like Wando was either the complex structure eroded, or it eroded or partially was even dismantled, so the morphemes were taken apart again. And the other hypothesis would be that you start out with a split predicate and there was fusion, and fusion far beyond the stem, because we do assume that the stem was complex. Possibly not 7 suffixes, but 2, 3 possible. Okay. So now if you look at it from a geographical perspective, you have two hypotheses. So if you start out with a compact predicate, and we assume Bantu was spoken somewhere in Cameroon, which would have been what I've called the Marcus Daan belt. You would have a complex predicate in Proto-Bantu, and Proto-Bantu in the modern Bantu languages in this area were adapting to the areal profile of the Mark-Sudan belt. And of course, the Bantu large spread zone outside the Mark-Sudan belt would just have stayed as it was as a proto-language. And according to our idea, you have a kind of moderately split predicate. This is in line with the Mark-Sudan belt tendency. Most of the languages are like that in this large area. And when Bantu moved out of that zone, there was several processes of fusion and ending up with a high infused predicate in what we know in Savannah Bantu in particular, or in southern and eastern Bantu. So our view is that Neus's reconstruction in figure 1 is relatively late, probably only in node 2 or 3, according to Güldemann and Al's phylogeny. And we do not assume that the version of Northwest Bantu should be ascribed to attrition or dismantling. So, what we will do in the following is, okay, so to the pre-stem now, the hypothesis I put forward in 2011 is the pre-stem structure was more complex. There were possibly structures where individual pronominal elements were fused to the word. So for instance, in a very simple predicate without any tense aspect marking, or the infinitive marker possibly could fuse with a verb root, or even sometimes the object marker in what was to become the macro stem. But there were also other structures, and these structures would have predominated, namely a split predicate with subject cross-reference and auxiliaries and tense aspect morphemes on the one hand, and the stem on the other hand. And the stem sometimes had possibly simple suffixes. And actually this multiple pattern is still inherited even in Southern Bantu. So in Zulu it has these still these structures, and you see how they fuse sometimes quite quickly. So in the remainder of part 2, we will argue that subject and object cross-reference, as found in Bantu today, are largely emerged late from free pronouns in Niger-Congo. And pronouns are advantageous for several reasons. So first, they are historically relatively stable. It's a restricted paradigm, as opposed, for instance, to multiple tense aspect markers. And of course, there have been recent advances in pronoun reconstruction actually in the area, so that we dispose of better material. So in 2.2 I refer first to some of my recent work, namely I came up with I would say, a robust Proto-Niger-Congo paradigm for free speech act participant pronouns. Important, it must not, possibly not Proto-Niger-Congo, because in Ubangi you don't find that paradigm, or most part of Ubangi. What is important for us, it involves a later innovation where the second singular was denasalized to what or just vowel or. Then what is important, these pronouns hardly ever involve bound verbal cross-reference in other Niger-Congo languages. So usually these are either free pronouns or pronouns bound to an auxiliary word or something like that, or of course part of other pronouns, possessives, etc. And well, according to Anderson, what I've just said, they often entered in so-called stem morphemes, subject, tense, aspect, modality, polarity morphemes, which were separated from the verb stem. So if you look at table 1, the first line has the reconstruction, that I call preliminary early Niger-Congo, and you see actually that this paradigm is found in a really large range of Niger-Congo, in independent families, and geographically distant, genealogically distant, so I do think this is a very likely reconstruction. Now we go over to pronouns and verbal cross-reference in Bantu, and you look at table 2, where you see the reconstructions of bound verbal cross-reference according to Merson's predicate template, and you see wide agreement. Yeah, there's virtually, apart from tackling the vowel quality, there's virtually no difference between the several reconstructions. So you turn the page, and now if you look at the full picture of pronominal elements in Bantu and compare this to the paradigm I reconstruct for Niger-Congo, you find some interesting things. So first, actually there are pronominal forms in Bantu too, who look highly similar to the Niger-Congo reconstruction. So especially if you look at independent pronouns, at possessives, emphatic series, etc., etc., these are reconstructed almost identically to the Niger-Congo reconstruction. So if you look at table 3, the second last column where you see Proto-Bantu nonverbal, it's very close to what I would propose for Niger-Congo. And of course you have this difference in the subject and object markers where you see there are several elements which actually are considerably different, and we will talk about those now. So first you have to tackle the different form of the subject-object prefix as compared to the me form in Congo and in Bantu in other contexts. Then you have the second singular object form, and then also the second plural form, which is different from the reconstruction muni, which is mu in Bantu. I won't talk about the third singular forms. Okay. We don't say those reconstructions are not valid. Yes, I think they are valid, but we would say they are valid for lower nodes in the family tree. And if we talk about Proto-Bantu, we would say they are not Proto-Bantu reconstructions, but later innovations in certain processes. So now if you look at this thing, what would you expect? According to our hypothesis, you would expect that the forms which are early in Niger-Congo are predominant or present in the northwest, and they kind of become erratic or totally absent away from the homeland area, so in eastern and southern Bantu. And those forms which are innovated, you would expect they do not yet exist in large parts of the northwest, particularly in zone A, but of course they become more and more frequent towards the south and east, and finally become regular bound or are regular bound verbal markers. And actually you would expect they never occur as independent forms. So the Bantu innovations would have been always bound, which is different with these cognates with the Niger-Congo canon. So of course you can imagine we didn't, or I didn't do it in going through hundreds of Bantu languages and looking all through the paradigms. What I've done, I've chosen a dirty shortcut. I looked at Babayev, which is a data collation of about 150 languages, and where the data gives actually the subject and object markers in those languages according to zones. And I looked through them and trying to see whether there are patterns, how different types of markers change with respect to bondedness, so whether there are prefixes or affixes or free forms, and with respect to their form. Do they look more similar to the Niger-Congo reconstruction, or do they are they of the so-called Proto-Bantu paradigm? And of course, there are many possibilities of errors. You know, there's the sample is erratic. The information, of course, in the table is not complete, etc., etc. So I'm sure in the statistics I give you, you can pick out one language and say, well, this was given wrongly by Babayev. I have misassigned it to a class. But I think if it's 150 languages, I do think one sees patterns, and this is what we will report on here. As I've said, they are coded, these markers, with respect to bondedness, affix versus free form, and according to the form, inherited from Benue-Kwa or Niger-Congo, Bantu, new Bantu form, or other. Of course, there are many other elements which don't belong to either. Okay. So now you look at the data survey first for the fusion profile, and what you see in table 4 is the dark shading is predominance of independent forms. Then the intermediate shading from zone B to H is there still exist free forms, but the bound forms are already more numerous. And of course then all the rest, all the other zones which are not mentioned explicitly in the table have throughout bonded forms. Yeah, and you see a clear geographical patterns according to our hypothesis. So in zone A, free forms predominate. B and C, they are still recurrent there. In D and H, sometimes free forms, and the rest, free forms are absent. Okay, we can go over to the next page, which is Okay, now something on bonding. What is important? People sometimes think, well, this is a huge difference between a compact morphological form, predicate, and free forms. Well, that's actually not the case. You find even dialects between languages. Some have bound morphology and the others have independent forms. So sometimes this difference can actually be a dialectal one. And the same holds true for word order alternation. So preposing the object before the verb stem, for instance. Or in general, syntactically preposing the object or putting it after verb, even that can be a dialectal difference. So these are not really huge and insurpassable, unsurmountable differences in the language. Okay, then now with respect to the forms. 4 minutes. Okay. Okay, now with respect to form, which is a bit more interesting. The first singular form is possibly the most problematic for our analysis because you find actually forms in N already widely outside narrow Bantu. But if you look at the general pattern, nevertheless in Bantu, it is a fact that N forms predominate in the northwest, especially in zone N. Then these are gradually replaced by N forms further south. But there are still occurrences of N forms sporadically also in the south and east. So even within Bantu, if you just look at in Bantu, the pattern would comply with our hypothesis. And we think there are additional arguments that the first singular N forms might still not be necessarily go back to an old N form, but rather be innovations also later in Bantu. So first singular cross-reference is among the earliest to fuse with other grammatical hosts and then become subject to assimilation. And this cross-linguistically end Bantu, so you can show that quite nicely that the first singular is different. Secondly, N in generally is more a marker of being a pronoun in general rather than M, which is more, says more about history and genealogy. This comes from a study by Nicholson and Peterson. So N forms are just likely to be there for typological reasons and not necessarily really be old in genealogical terms. And finally, what is particularly important, there are clear cases that actually M forms are reshaped towards N form, and this outside of Benue Congo. So in Central Sudan, we have 4 independent cases where a Mi form changed to N or Ni. And this, not of course in the first singular, but in a totally different pronoun, namely the second person singular. But in terms of formal things, Mi to Ni is apparently a process which is, for several reasons, not so unlikely. Okay, then second person singular. Well, if you look at the formal differences across Bantu, actually you see there are weaker velar consonants being introduced in zone B, and then this is gradually fortified towards K, and this is actually present there. So we assume that Q is possibly the result of gradual fortition of the vocalic marker U. Then for the 2 form, that is actually pretty easy because there's no difference to Niger-Congo, and within Bantu you can clearly say it was U rather than E, although you have some Bantu languages that don't have E. And now with the second plural form, the pattern actually is very similar to the first singular. Well, there are some problems with counting the second plural forms. You can ask me later if you are really interested, because I run out of time. But overall, the pattern is N forms predominate in the northwest, and in zone H, interestingly, they are gradually replaced by M forms further southeast, but then still occur sporadically there. I skipped the thing with the second person singular as addressing marking, and then try to come to summarize in table, so on page 9 of the handout. The overall picture in Niger-Congo you see in Bantu, you see in table 5. Again, the dark shaded cells are pronominal forms which are close to the Niger-Congo reconstruction. The intermediately shaded cells are where you still find Niger-Congo reflexes, and the white cells is you just have the Bantu reconstructions. And again, the geographical patterns is in the northwest you have Niger-Congo, then it becomes thinner and thinner, eventually you have the Bantu reconstruction. So the Bantu reconstruction should be clear then. First singular person Mi possibly already an N or Ni form in certain contexts. Then a second singular form U instead of Ku, a first person plural form Tu, and the second plural form Nu instead of the bound concord Nu. These pronouns became less frequent, and now if you see actually the innovations, we think actually there is sense how, or you can understand why they or how they developed. The Ku, the second singular, is basically fortition and basically seeding off the macro stem from the pre-stem. So this is one idea how you can explain that U in the third singular and second singular actually introduced the consonant because it preserves the macro stem, and Mu actually enhances the paradigmatic contrast with the first person singular, which was by then already N. So you would have say, okay, N is first singular, so you change the second plural to M. So there are some reasons why this happened. And so now I give over to her.
Okay.
Yes.
Now we get to shift the other side. So someone asked me, it was Derek, he thought, did Tom and I have a fight? Why do we have two separate handouts? It wasn't that we didn't agree, we decided to divide up the discussion in these time and collaboration between pre-stem and the verb stem. So I'm going to be looking at the verb stem, and so if you go to the second handout here, the one that says Proto-Bantu verb stem, the references for this are at the end of this, the combined references on Tom's, and I accidentally printed out my references at the end of my handout. What I wanted to do is two things here. So I wanted to do something a little old, not exactly old, but retrospective, thinking where are we post-Mayusin? What do we know about the verb stem now that we might not have known in 1967? So I'll spend a few minutes on that, and then I wanted to try to do something new and specifically start thinking harder about the final vowel, because that seems to have gotten a lot less attention than the extensions in the root when we look at the overall structure of the verb stem. So by the verb stem, I mean everything from sort of the root plus the extensions all the way to the final vowel. I think from my perspective, I think one of the most sort of significant improvements of our understanding of the verb stem since Mayusin 67 is recognizing the importance of its phonological properties, that it's not just a morphological unit consisting of a number of morphemes in particular slots, but it's a morphophonological unit, and the phonological generalizations that apply over it are very important for understanding historical change in the family. In bullet 2, I briefly go over the sort of canonical shape that I think we're all familiar with. It has a sort of a CV, open syllable structure, possibly extended. In terms of the final vowel that I'll come back to later, the standard reconstructions have been something like two final vowels, a kind of default A, plus maybe a subjunctive A, and then possibly a third one, more like A or E, marking something like perfective. The final vowel has the role of finishing off the open syllabic structure of the verb stem by having a sort of final E morpheme to add to that syllable structure. There are lots of known deviations from the canonical structure. I briefly go over those in 3, but I won't discuss them further here. These have been studied for some time. I think while many people will be aware of these points here, I think it's just worth repeating that a lot of research has shown the importance of the phonological properties of the verb stem. On the one hand, it's known to be subject to minimality constraints. So in a lot of languages, we see evidence that it should minimally be CV, and when it's not for some reason, maybe the verb root is too short, various repair strategies come in. Almost contrarily, we also see restrictions on maximality. So especially in the Northwest, but really throughout the region, there are various processes that keep it from getting too large. So it simultaneously has minimality while also having maximality. And then there are the segmental positional constraints that we see as well in roots and in the stem. Probably in the vowels are where they're most significant, where we only see the full range of vowel contrast in the first vowel of the root and then reduced afterwards. There's this trough idea that Larry's mentioned also as well. Tone comes into and shows similar patterns of reduction. I think it's important to bear these phonological properties in mind because when we're looking at historical change, and what I'll be talking about in the rest of the talk, things that happen at the right edge, some of the changes seem very much conditioned by the phonological features of the verb stem and sort of promoted by its phonological properties. So I go in 5, I talk about one long-standing, or we mentioned this one long-standing proposal for the origin of the associative or the reciprocal. So the on coming from a reanalysis of a preposition na after the verb. So there would have been the sequence, CVC root, followed by a final vowel, followed by na, a with preposition. And that ana sequence was open to reinterpretation as not a plus na, but rather on plus a, and then the preposition sort of incorporates into the verb. But that's only possible as a reanalysis, or really pushed across, because of the phonological resemblances, because ana happens to have that VCV shape that looks like a reanalyzable sort of extension plus final vowel pattern. And that sort of pattern, maybe less strikingly, may be responsible for certain kinds of shallow changes. So I just have one example here of an innovative negative marker in Bafia, where a CV negative particle seems to have incorporated into the stem to make a negative suffix in this b form. And the fact that it was a CV shape in the CV-CV structure may have sort of precipitated or helped allow that reanalysis to happen. So that's sort of looking back, I think, some of the things we've come to understand about the verb stem since Meeuwsen. And now I want to come to this issue of the final vowel, because it seems to have received less attention. We have our standard reconstructions, but I don't know if we know exactly how that inflectional pattern arose. And what I wanted to do was start to look and do a pilot survey of the Northwest to see what was happening at the right edge of the verb stem there. One first question I just want to raise is, what was the source of these final vowels? Some of them may go back to some level to Niger-Congo, but there has to have been significant Bantu restructuring in different ways. But some of those alternations, there may have already been final vowels in a CV-CV Niger-Congo stem. But even if we look, I have an example here now from a Bantoid language spoken just north of the grass fields, the language Mumbang. We see lots of sources of small particle-like things that appear after verbs, not just in Bantoid, but throughout the Macro Sudan, large parts of Africa, West Africa. Here's an example in 7C, and I should add, I'll have to be selective on this handout. I have more material than I can discuss. I'm happy to take questions or comments about anything in the handout. If we look at 7C, we can see that there's a perfect clitic. It's analyzed by a clitic by Lundgren that appears after verbs marking a perfect tense. So we get, and that's a form a that appears after the verb. These kinds of markers are obviously lots of things we might want to survey them to understand sources of the final vowel patterns. Other sources, I mentioned an E, sentence final interrogative markers, and also other postverbal negative particles. There's also the importance of immediate after verb position that we'll probably be hearing about maybe in Jannika's talk in a day or two, which obviously places lots of things in that special position, or even sentence final position in intransitive sentences may also effectively be immediate after verb position, giving us source morphemes for the final vowel patterns. And so what I'll do in the rest of the talk is give some sort of highlight results of this pilot survey. I started with Zone A. I wanted to go through lots of Zone A, get through B and C, but I didn't quite make it, so I got through a good amount of A, 1B and 1C language, but we'll see sort of what was there, what was happening at the right edge in final vowel patterns. And I was interested in what this might reveal about the status of the final vowel in Proto-Bantu, whatever node we might be working with, and also what categories can kind of be coded by it as a primary or secondary exponent. The first languages are just ordered by like Guthrie zone 10, 20, 30, 40, right? There's not much, there's no other rhyme or reason to that. I won't say much about Akose except for one small thing. If you look at the Akose paradigm, it looks like a system that is to some extent breaking down the way that we might otherwise sort of expect in the Northwest. But also, if we look at the right edge, there is sort of extra suffixal material that's appearing, sort of breaking down on the one hand, but also building up, which is something that you see in other Northwest languages that we'll see, which is something to look at as sources for the Proto-Bantu pattern. And then if we look, I'll say something more. We heard about Bakuri yesterday, and we already saw the summary of the system in Michael Marlowe's talk. I want to highlight two additional things. The overall system is summarized in 10A. It has 3 final vowels following the canonical reconstruction. But there's also this point that we see in various languages that I think is probably understudied and appreciated. The presence of verb roots that have a lexical final vowel that does not participate in the normal final vowel alternation. So I think this is a sort of a puzzle, a historical puzzle about what's going on with these verb roots, where did these sort of exceptional roots develop? Is it because some might be too small? So these are, the 2 examples are in 10B, we've got va and then lahize. Maybe in some cases the subminimality is an impact of the lack of final vowel, or perhaps there's something else going on with the link that's causing that. Another interesting feature of Bakwiri in 7C is it's innovated a new final vowel, this e vowel at the end that appears in sort of relative and question context. And what this is, I think, showing us is that something in the Northwest is producing some of the sources you might need to see. Like there must be morphological sources of producing innovative patterns and actually extending the final vowel pattern past the sort of canonical reconstruction there. I won't, the point of a yasa, so I won't go through the yasa data. A yasa is an example of a language that's maintained the phonological final vowel. It stays there on the roots, but if you actually look at the overall suffixal pattern, the final vowel is completely phonologically incorporated into the root. So the root now is a CD structure, and all of the suffixes seem to have a CD suffixal form. So we've lost the final vowel as a morphological entity, even though it's phonologically retained. Sort of going now to make a point sort of in the time remaining. This is in bullet 12 now in Bhatia. On page 5, I give the overall system in 12a. I'll let you look at that at your own if you want to see how the pieces combine. I'm more interested in the Bhatia case in the data in 12b, especially the second two examples. This is something that recurred in various other languages of the survey where there are interesting patterns of right edge morphophonology. Oh, great, perfect, yeah. Morphophonology that are causing what look like morphologically more complex or phonologically more complex structures being simplified on the surface to overall sort of simpler surface forms, which might be giving us the source of, again, new right edge patterns that could be the source of new final vowels or final vowel patterns. So if we look specifically at the third example under 12b, this is he had taken the money. It's analyzed by Borisma as something like the verb is underlyingly like te with a guano stop and then ka. But it surfaces in a very nice canonical looking shape of tekka. It looks like a CVC final vowel pattern. And this suggests to me a couple of things. One, we want to start looking at the right edge phonology to see where new final vowel patterns might have arisen in general. But also this the default may have had multiple sources at the Proto-Bantu, or at least at the reconstructed Proto-Bantu stage. Perhaps there were various morphemes that became reduced, and one of the reasons for the sort of strange default distribution of the might be that it's historically a source of multiple different final morphemes that have sort of come together in different ways as well. So I think looking at sound change patterns on the right edge might give us interesting insights into what happened in that final vowel spot. Ngunu shows something similar. It's a little more extreme in 13. I'll let you look at the data yourself to sort of see that it's verified. But in this case, it's described that the final vowel is being retained as a morphological entity, and that extension separated from the root. But it's completely predictable based on vowel harmony from the root. So it's doing almost no morphological work. So it has this minimal functional load. It just sort of says this is a verb. But no distinctions are encoded because vowel harmony has sort of obliterated all of the functional distinctions. To the extent that that's the case, I think what that is again suggesting is the importance of looking at sound change as a source of actually reducing the final vowel pattern at some stage of Bantu that gave us the sort of compact reduced state within the standard reconstructions. I'll skip over the Makha data in 14. Just sort of another pattern of where sound change may have mattered. In the Makha case, it has to do with the way the verb and the following NP interact with each other for final vowel appearance. But I'm happy to go through that data at some point any other time today. And I want to otherwise jump on to the Kaka data in 15. This is a language that has 15a shows a sort of a clean instance of the final element paradigm. This is the verb see, where there are 5 different markers according to the source, including a 0 marker, 3 different vocalic markers, and then a ma marker. Sort of like what we saw in Bhatia, if we look in 15c, in one instance, the ma marker, when I give the infinitive in the past forms, actually reduces to just an a marker. So the next to last data set, when we have verb stems ending in ya, or ngwa, or sa, the ma reduces phonologically to a. Again, pointing to the fact that there may have been more diverse sources of these ahs historically, sort of reducing, and so the ah we see today, or that we're so accustomed to, perhaps had multiple historical sources, if this Kaka example is possibly indicative of other historical processes of change. Kaka also shows something else that was mentioned in Larry's talk that I think is possibly understudied. I don't think we have a good survey of it. But what is the final vowel marking? We normally think of it as marking sort of tense, aspect, mood categories. But there are these languages where it also seems to mark whether a stem is either long or extended. Obviously, these are overlapping categories. If a root has an extension, it is a little longer. So you get a different vowel in an extended stem or in a stem with certain extensions happening. It sort of happens with the elay suffix, but what I'm talking about is broader than that. In 15d, this is from the source, there's a description of what final vowels can appear on what stems. And there's a variation depending on the final consonant of the stem, but also whether it's a 2-syllable or a 3-syllable stem. And just to highlight one of these vowels, if you look at the open ah vowel in the final column, it only appears on 2-syllable stems. So, or 2-syllable roots, I mean, when the stem is 2 syllables total. So what that suggests is the final vowel is simultaneously encoding sometimes TMA things, but in the infinitive, also whether a stem is long or short or extended or not. And it makes this, it's a sort of a strange, I hadn't thought until this talk, that final vowel category is a strange inflectional category. There's this default ah. I don't think you see many cases where you have to throw it on maybe for phonological reasons, but here it's also sort of coding whether a stem is long or short, in addition to all of the sort of TMA things it codes in strange syncretic ways. So just to sort of add this into what was it really encoding, what was the work it was doing, to what extent was that work phonological, and to what extent was it morphological. In my last sort of 30 seconds, I'll go over my B and C language. They don't have that much more to add that the A languages didn't already have. And just sort of highlight some of the points I mentioned in the third section of the handout. I think what struck me, which I did not realize before I began this survey, is when we look at what's happening in these A languages, the sort of simplicity of the Meiosin reconstruction was actually striking. So how did this really tight, relatively small, highly inflectionalized system develop when we see a much sort of messier system in the Northwest? Oops, stop that, it's telling me to stop. And then the other thing I want to make, this is more methodological, and I don't know if anyone means this when they sort of talk about Northwest being reduced, but I think it's very easy to see the Northwest languages. When we use this term reduced, it's very easy to accidentally see this as meaning, oh, there's not much information left in there. But in fact, I think very often these reductions are quite revealing of possibly the historical processes that may have been implicated into the more canonical Bantu we know from the East as well. So there seems to be a lot more great work, a lot of great sources to do in the Northwest, which seems to be the next kind of frontier of a lot of this work. So, thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. Larry?
Yeah, oh, yes. Well, I actually have a short question to Tom and also to Jeff. I was just wondering, there are some languages where you get in the first person singular, the independent pronoun me is subject, but a nasal agreement on the verb. And those languages, would you say that they have broken down an earlier system, or would you, how would you view those?
With the first person singular, as I said, it's quite likely that Proto-Bantu, early Bantu already had me and still had me as also used sometimes the subject pronoun and the bound marker with n. And I mean, this is the problem. Usually we tend to reconstruct symmetrical and full paradigms, but actually if you look in Bantu and in other languages, often paradigms are not this way, and the first person singular is one of the forms which is highly likely to be the first being bound. So I would think an n form is early in certain contexts, so, but nevertheless there was still an independent me as well, and that's how you get pattern you're referring to.
So I didn't think this would come up because he did the pronoun work, but one thing that does strike me, at least, see, I know this happens up in the Bemoid area, and you probably know this too. In sort of Indo-European languages, the way nasalization works generally is the coda nasal, or the nasal after the consonant that causes nasalization on the vowel. Sorry, the post-vowel nasal causes that sort of nasalization, is anticipatory nasalization. But I know I get lots of preservatory nasalization, say in Naki and these other areas. Sometimes I wonder if that N, me plus verb starting with consonant, you get a sort of reanalyzed nasalized vowel that actually caused that N to appear sooner. I feel like I've seen that. I don't know if that works in Bantu, but I feel like that works in Grassfield. So that nice me, maybe by a phonetic accident, created the seeds for an N prefix. But that's just a speculation that you've never heard before today. But I wonder if that N is partly phonological and reanalyzed as morphological.
I mean, there are interesting cases where in Madi you have me throughout, but with vowel initial verbs you have me. So I mean, there are several cases where it's really exactly like.
Sarah?
Thank you. My question is also about the table on page 9.
Tom's handout.
Yes, right, the first one. So you said
Table 5?
The table, yes, that's correct. It's just out of curiosity. So you said that in general, old Niger Congo forms, you find them more in zone A, B, C, and then as you know, the further down you go, the less you find them. But then there is something that strikes me in this table, and it is that if you look at the second person, it is throughout, if I understand.
Yes, but the second, yes, I should have said, well, the second person singular subject is uninteresting because it is the same as the Niger Congo form. It's just U.
Right, right.
And then, so I possibly I should have taken out the column altogether because you know there is no issue between the Bantu innovation and the Niger Congo form.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that is true also of the second person plural. Like in general, there is more shading than say the first person singular. And I was wondering if that can have a sort of, I don't know, functional explanation, or if there might be a reason, like in some language families, like.
Well, you know, this shading throughout the table is a bit misleading because basically I have lumped under rest 6, 7 zones. So if you look at it from a geographical perspective, it's just true that the second plural, I mean, is more stable throughout Bantu. So there are sporadic occurrences also deeper into the area, but the overall picture is never is the same because it's lacking the Niger Congo cognate is lacking in the D2, F, G, J, and P. So
right. The point I wanted to make is that in other language families like Tibeto-Burman, Scott Delancey has written about this. You get innovations depending on pragmatic factors when you have speech participant pronouns. So my question was related to that. And might there be like a correlate to this for innovation or not? But thank you.
yeah, they're interesting. I mean, you have this plural addressee marker. And so the second person, yes, it is more active and dynamic in Bantu too. So
Okay, time is up. Sorry, Sebastian. Let's thank our speakers again.